the singular experience when I speak to men who have been in this situation where they are highly sexualized or feel objectified or whatever. The kind of similar degrees of entitlement from people who purchase them or who view them being on display seems identical to all of my discussions with women who are in those same spaces.
Hello and welcome to Fuck Yeah, the podcast where we say fuck yeah to transgressive autofiction. I'm one of your hosts, Sarah. I'm joined by Robin, who is back in the vulva trailer.
I know. I can't believe I forgot about it.
The pink womb.
The womb. Yeah. And I would say this is probably my fuck yeah this week, is just rediscovering this trailer that I was obsessed with for a while. And then kind of forgot about, but I think I'm going to start podcasting all the time from here. So nice. Get used to it.
Oh, yeah. It's nice to see you back in the trailer. You spent so much time on making it so fabulous and pink.
Yeah, I really hope I get to keep it in the split and everything. But it is so about the sensory experience of color and texture, of soft fuzziness. And this part that I'm in right now is the vaginal part. It's the soft, cushy lounge area. And then you squeeze through this tight area that's the cervical space of the kitchen. And it expands into the uterus, which is the area where there's the table. And you do tarot and learn about yourself.
I like that you have seen, like you've fully fleshed out the analogy here.
Yes, fleshed out is the term.
Trailer.
Yeah, definitely.
We're doing something unusual on the podcast today. Mm-hmm. We have a cis man here with us.
What?
Which is, fairly unusual for us. We are expanding our horizons. No, I mean, this seems like a nice counterbalance to our decentering men conversation that we had last week. We're talking today with Chris Zeischegg, and someone that we've worked with, but Chris is a writer, filmmaker. He spent years working in porn as Danny Wilde. And he's had 2 books come out this year, Creation on Art and Unbecoming, which is a series of short stories and essays, which we read. And then a re-release of his novel, The Magician, also came out this year. And we're going to talk to him about the book Creation, which features Luka Fisher, someone who actually I would guess a lot of our listeners know Luka from the LA queer art scene, a longtime collaborator with Chris. And I feel like, so I met Chris through when I started doing video production for Damiana and like offering like educational videos, product videos, those sorts of things for clients. I had to quickly pull together a production team in LA, and we got connected, and he was so amazing to have on set. I think we worked on set together for a full year and was super bummed when he decided he did not want to work on set anymore and he was just focusing on post-production. So I'm glad I get to still work with him. But when I realized that there was the connection with Luka, I was like, oh, there's something else about this Chris guy.
I was surprised. I was
that
like,
I don't know about.
Yeah.
So I think it was at that stage that I got really curious and was like, I don't think Chris is a normie.
Yeah. There's definitely way more than meets the eye when it comes to Chris. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and his his book Creation is I mean, it is not a light read. So, you know, if I wouldn't suggest that anyone who doesn't have some experience with I guess like in some ways we talked about Substance a little bit in our last episode, the film that's like a real brutalist kind of body horror film. There were elements of this book that felt kind of similar to the Substance, where it was like, wow, this is really hard to read. This is like a very intense and visceral confrontation of the ways in which, like, I mean, mostly men, right? Like violently objectify women and sex workers.
It's got some really interesting elements around objectification that we usually only hear about from the female perspective or from women being objectified. And his lived experience in the porn industry is so interesting to hear what it is like to be an objectified man. I mean, he did straight and gay porn, and which, you know, is always so pitched from the male perspective, like this dream job, but to kind of hear at least his experience with how that affected him over time to be under such intense objectification is really, it's fascinating. And it comes through in his book. I will say it's like, there are parts that are hard to read, but it's also really well written, you know?
Oh my gosh. Yes. And vulnerable.
Very vulnerable, and a lot of the body horror stuff, it does ease you into it. It's not just slapping you right off the bat, but it is a lot of writing about, you know, thoughts around suicide and self-harm and then art that can come out of that.
And PTSD. So again, like if these are topics that are really hard for you to listen to, like content warning right now, we are going to be talking about depression, self-harm, death. And so, yeah, I mean, proceed with caution, I would say, if that's, those are difficult topics for you. I felt confronted in a good way. Like I like being challenged in that a lot of what is being written about in the book is very much from the male perspective and experiences that I often attribute to the female lived experience. And so I really appreciated the challenge around like, or the reminder of like, hey, toxic masculinity is harmful for all of us. The ways in which the sex trade in our society is also causes a lot of harm, and not just to women. Yeah.
And it's fascinating to hear his perspective about it. And he's very thoughtful. And there's also this great relationship that he has with Luka Fisher that we dive into a little bit. And I don't know, Chris just has like such nuance to him, kind of an unexpected nuance, which what challenges me is like my typical thoughts about like, okay, here's this white cis guy. What are we going to talk about? And he just has such an interesting perspective, you know? So
yeah, and I definitely think that the kind of worldview in the book is a complicated and nuanced perspective on sex work specifically. And so I think I really encourage folks who are kind of in that space or possibly even just processing their own interactions within the trade. Like it's a really interesting read.
Yeah. And I would say because we're really holding space for his perspective around the porn industry, and we do talk about like feminist porn and stuff like that and the kind of like left and right view of pornography. But I don't want people to think that like we're against porn. You know, it's just a nuanced discussion around the side of porn that we usually don't discuss that much around, you know, exploitation and how it affects people over time.
Yeah, I think generally like we try to hold space for the complexities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, what we're kind of going into this conversation, into this very like complex piece of work around. So, yeah, come join us on that ride into nuance. And
Yes.
happy New Year, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
We hope that you all are enjoying, whether like it's family time or chosen family time, or maybe some like queer joy and celebration and partying, or rest and restorative, like some sleep, some hydration. Like we're just sending you lots of love.
Yeah, and happy 2025. And we only have one episode left in the season.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that crazy? So we'll have one more episode after this, and then we'll be taking a little hiatus, and then we'll be back.
Yeah, season 4 is almost coming to an end. Thanks for being on this ride with us.
Yes.
Let's bring Chris on.
All right, let's do it.
Fuck yeah. Chris, hi. Welcome to Fuck Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's nice to interact with you in this space. I feel like we're usually working on video editing together. So this is nice to dive into your work.
Yeah, that's very true. We have, we've known each other for several years, but correct. We mostly work on kind of corporate video together, right?
Which is kind of like a weird space to intersect with you on, because I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit with the book, but there's like the first, or I guess maybe it's the second chapter of the book where you're talking about Luka Fisher, and I have questions about really kind of how like autobiographical it is, but I felt like I'm just kind of like eating up news or information about people that I know and am just curious about on a personal level. And we kind of like, I don't know, we're sort of at the edges of each other's community, but then the space where we connect is this weird kind of like corporate video space.
Yes.
You're right. You're right.
In that context, like when Sarah was like, spilling the tea about you, I was like, wait, what? Chris does what? The editor? Oh, okay. Oh, Luka Fisher. Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah, it's really interesting to get to know you more through this work that you made also, because I was like, even within the book, there's so much variation in your self-expression through it. And I'm like, who is this guy? Like so much more depth than I could have ever imagined from just our, at me handing stuff off to you to edit for these corporate videos. So it's still sex toy corporate videos. Okay. So It is like the most fun of all corporate videos that we could be making.
Fair enough. You're totally right. I have a little bit of memory of speaking to you, Robin, at I think Tristan Taormino's like book launch, when I don't think either of us really knew who each other were, except via Sarah, like working in this very professional, like corporate space, right? And then you were kind of like, wait, you're just like a normie white guy, right?
Right.
which like maybe part of me, it's like leading into that, but I guess that's not 100% of the.
Yeah, I mean, but it's so interesting, the depth that some people have when you start looking behind the normie white guy curtain, not that, anyone's, I'm not defining you in that way, but you know how it is. Like,
to be fair, I think I probably present to a lot of people as a very normie white lady. So, I'm right there with you, Chris.
There's a lot behind that curtain, Sarah.
Chris, is there anything that's giving you a fuck yeah right now?
Well, I'm going to give you a very normie white guy answer because
great.
I'm
leaning
into very basic self-care stuff these days. So I would just say things like exercise and sleep, to be honest, are a big fuck yeah lately. I need to do that all the time.
I think going back to the basics sometimes is what you have to do. Like, I'm like, okay, if I drink enough water today, I got some exercise. Okay, that's like, I'm doing pretty good.
Agreed. Yeah.
I don't know if it was a couple months ago, but it was, I guess, right when Creation came out. And you shared on your socials a response from a YouTuber that was so intense. She was expressing such dislike of this book where you kind of go like, why did you pick this book up? Like, clearly this is not the genre of book that you should be reading.
Right.
But I was really compelled by her, like how upset she was about having spent time reading your book. And then also the fact that you posted it. And I was like, okay, I have to finally read Chris's books and like know what's going on here, because if it's causing this kind of reaction, then there's obviously something really transgressive happening in your writing. And so I'm curious, like, what Creation means to you, or like, is the reviewer like missing the point, or is her response actually part of maybe what you're seeking in your writing?
I think the answer is probably yes to both of those things. First of all, I grew up getting just very into, I guess, genres of art, meaning music, film, literature, that often had a very like visceral, violent, sexual affectation to it. Meaning, like, I grew up into like extreme metal and hardcore scenes. I was in those kind of bands growing up. I was very into horror films and liked, when I first got into reading books, I was into authors like Bret Easton Ellis, Dennis Cooper. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but a lot of this stuff is quote unquote labeled transgressive. I think that label is kind of doesn't have the same power anymore, because I think our world has shifted quite drastically in the last 20, 30 years, where, I don't know, explicit sex and violence to me doesn't feel like it's really breaking boundaries in a fictional context. And I think this book kind of deals with that. So, I had an aesthetic sensibility growing up that I sort of developed through these genres to talk about just a lot of parts of my life, which is just like emotional volatility. I think for a lot of young men, especially in these like underground aggressive music scenes, I think learn to talk about things like, I don't know, if you look at like black metal, for example, in one way it's like super fucking cheesy, right? It's like developed by these like Nordic depressed teens who are just going through the same shit as any young people, which is just like, dealing with love and suicidal ideation, but talking about it through the lens of like satanic myth or like all this, and then doing really kind of insane, violent performance art stuff in the context of their work. Well, that sounded really exciting to me as a young person. And then, I got into pornography to pay my way through school at a really young age. I started at 19. And I stayed in that world up until I kind of got forced out sort of by a medical situation around the age of 28. But I was still like hustling and stuff on the side until I could figure out this other career path that has ended with me, doing the work for you and a lot of other brands in the kind of video production department. But that's actually pretty recent in terms of my life. So there's a few things going on here. At the beginning of all of that, I got really involved in kind of like pro-porn feminism and kind of sexual politics surrounding sex work, which to me at the time, I was very sincere about promoting, though, on the long enough timeline, I think I've kind of changed my tune about, I don't know, this kind of work's effect on people, or at least myself and a lot of the people who I've grown up with in that community. I'm trying to soften my stance a little bit these days because I know like I'm not like my experience is not everyone's experience, but there is kind of like a trajectory that I feel like most people who do this work have if they stay in for 10 plus years. And it's usually like the beginning, there is a lot of excitement around very basic things that probably help people with like the self-esteem around like, oh yeah, it's nice to make money and know that people want to have sex with you and that you're viewed maybe, especially at that young of an age, as for the first time, as like having this sexual power in the world. That was true for me. I was this very depressed, shy little kid. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know, both men and women were like paying me money to fuck. And that's kind of an exciting thing.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, doing that work for 10, 12 years, the other side of that is I just don't really believe that a lot of the sort of like empowerment manifestos around that stuff, meaning like, you know, I get to do whatever I want. I express myself in this sexual way and I feel really empowered. Well, like to do a job in sort of our capitalist world, to be good at that, you have to be good at doing what your client wants.
Right.
You know what I mean? And at some point for me, that was just like realizing to be good as a sex worker, I'm essentially a fucking cum rag. And, you know, having known so many people in that world who have committed suicide, who have basically been totally PTSD'd out, myself included. Yeah. And there are a few people who I think have managed this in a long-term way, but I think they have had to find a pretty extreme balance of taking like massive amounts of time off in between doing this work to sustain their life in a way that's like emotionally sustainable. For a lot of other people, I think the burnout is way more intense than I've seen in most other industries, other than maybe something like the military or whatever.
Sure.
So this book is like, I guess, me dealing with that experience in my life through the lens of these aesthetic sensibilities that I picked up as a kid. And then having written a number of books that kind of all have the same thing. It's like this young man who's kind of based on me, who is either a porn performer or hustler or whatever, and essentially doesn't understand how to get what he wants, is basically this like depressed fuck up and ends up being killed or murdered. And I was just like, why do I keep writing this story over and over? How do I get out of that pattern? And when I was putting together this collection, you know, I included all of that work, but one of the things that I wanted to kind of change trajectory with is talk about some of the sincere relationships I have in my life. And so there is this woman who is an incredibly close friend of mine named Luka Fisher, who in the middle of kind of the most chaotic part of my sex work career and art practice, she helped me do all these kind of insane projects. And she was also, you know, at that time putting out a lot of zines and other things that were facilitating me writing some of these short stories. So I interviewed her for a magazine that kind of folded like back in 2015. And it was kind of just this really sincere essay/interview with her. And I wanted to intersperse more of that through the book. And there's only like really 3 of those, but they kind of make up the beginning, middle, and end. And that became a structure for the short story collection, and something that I felt was a nice balance of where I'm at, which is still the kind of brutality of this work, and then talking about this really sincere, platonic, joyful relationship I have with my friend.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I mean, there's so much in what you just said that I think we want to dive into, and I definitely want to talk about Luka Fisher and like how she shows up in the book. Okay. But as you were talking, I'm actually so happy I was able to like turn to this page. There was a passage in here where you're sort of taking on the voice of a narrator as you are now. I mean, it's a really interesting, I really appreciate how the book is written. It like gives you a lot of different, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really a literary analytics person, but I felt like there were lots of creative ways that you write that gives you kind of like a lot to chew on. Mm-hmm. And this use of the narrator in this essay was really interesting to me because your snark came through the narrator. And so this passage is, the author is fucking horrible at setting boundaries, but he wants me to note that this was not an isolated incident. Many potential clients approached him for the legally precarious act of prostitution. They swooned at the emotional vulnerability he displayed in all things related to pumping them full of cock. And they balked at the suggestion that an exchange might cost them more than a tank of gas. And that was like, gosh, it's such a rich passage. And there is like a real disdain or critique. I won't say disdain, but a real critique of sex work to me that came through. And like also being part of that like pro-porn feminist move, like that's kind of where I came up. I remember the first porn that I watched that I loved was Tristan Taormino's Chemistry, where like porn performers are like who've wanted to work together. It's kind of like this reality scenario. And I remember being really moved by the power of porn. Like it was like I finally found porn that meant something to me and that I found erotic and that was enticing. And so, you know, everyone kind of jumped on this bandwagon of like, no, porn isn't just exploitation, and you're not really a great feminist if you don't get on this bandwagon of being in support of diverse representations of sexuality. In the book, you offer a real counterpoint to that, which to me felt like this discussion is much more complex and we actually can't be in one camp or the other because it's not a black or white issue. Mm-hmm. Like there are there's real exploitation that's happening. There's a lot of trauma that people are experiencing. Like it's sort of an invitation to think about it in a more complex way, I guess I should say. It's like that's what I felt like I took from some of these essays.
Yeah, in the early 2000s, when I did get involved with people like Tristan Taormino, who I still think very highly of, but you know, it was a pushback, in my opinion, to, you know, there was like obviously the longstanding like moral position from the right wing about like this is bad from like a moral point of view, but on the left there was a real resurgence of kind of like anti-porn feminism that is based on kind of like the concept that all sex work is, like you said, exploitation, and that no one has any real agency, particularly women working in these fields like pornography. And then especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of women were voluntarily getting into porn, even in directorial points of view, and Tristan was one of them. And doing things that I think from the outside looked very much like, yeah, I mean, this is, I don't know, quote unquote, a more real representation of people's sexuality within these spaces. And then, you know, there were all sorts of offshoots of that and sort of like queer porn and so forth. And I was meeting a lot of these people, and the conversations we were having were really interesting. And I think I was still new enough that I had not felt any of the burnout on my end. But as time went on, I was also feeling this incredible isolation as a result of that work, and complexity, especially revolving around how this affects romantic relationships, my relationships with family, my relationships with potential colleagues. And on a really just fundamental level, there were some of the things that people had talked about that are the stereotypes of this shit that were just like, despite what I was saying publicly, still felt kind of like, oh no, wait, this was actually kind of an awful experience. And I don't have any, I feel scared to say that out loud because everyone I'm around is like, no, like porn is this can, or at least can be this great feminist empowering thing. And I was like, well, why do I feel like shit so much of the time? And, you know, one of the things in recent years, having reconnected with some of those people, it was like almost unilaterally, everyone has started talking about the same experience, you know, like I also felt that way and I couldn't say anything about it. And the interesting thing to me was also when I spoke to men, because this was often seemed like, oh, well, women are the sort of victims or the ones who are being exploited. And I had this conversation even extremely recently with a guy, and I'm not going to mention his name, but, you know, he was contracted with one of the biggest companies out there for a year working constantly. And he was saying to me, you know, I couldn't say this out loud because who would feel sorry for me? But right. I wanted to fucking kill myself every single day. And it's like, so I at this point in my life, you know, I'm out of it. And so I don't have as much wrapped up in that. And I want to say explicitly, I don't have negative feelings towards sex workers. I believe sex workers should be treated with the same respect and rights and everything else as the rest of the population. Though I think this is, I don't know if I can then advocate that this is like a great thing for people to do either.
Right.
On my experience of life. So I don't know. This work that I do in a literary context is not meant to be political or to have kind of a moral stance here, other than it's just like my way of working through this. And I guess I have some sort of aesthetic things I'm looking to achieve here, but it's not meant to be like a jumping off point for what to do or what the politics should be. I don't really have an answer there.
Well, and I don't think it comes off that way either. It definitely doesn't feel political. I would say it like that first story. I don't think it's an essay, right? Of the it's not the perfect piece. It's the most important part. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
The most important part. And I think it's such an interesting title for it also, but I have not read a description of depression in that way that, I mean, it really resonated with me of how this person's just going through their life and of this like, you know, eventually seeking out death, but not seeking to kill themselves, but seeking to just stop the malaise and being confronted with this. I actually yelled out to the book when I read this part of, you know, feeling like they're aging out. He's feeling like he's aging out of being desirable and then mentions the number 30. I was like, holy shit. But like having kind of forgotten about, you know, that's where this level of objectification, like I feel like objectification has kind of taken his life in this direction of meaninglessness. So being objectified and having that be where his sense of value comes from, and that starts disappearing as you start expiring or aging out of desirability as an object, and how quickly that happens, like that would happen at 30. And it was really resonating with me in the way of that I think a lot of women who are, you know, kind of continuously objectified through, you know, childhood and beyond. And as a lot of women start aging, there's this thing of just like desperately trying to hold on to youth in an attempt to hold on to one's value. But it's in this system of objectification, which is actually not serving them and everything. But to see it through a man's eyes through a, who also is using objectification for work, which most people do on some level, even like the dress codes for women at the office or whatever, like look presentable, put your makeup on and like all this stuff, but to see through this hustler's eyes, like how his sense of worth is just disappearing and how, the most important part, when it actually gets down to that important part, it is just this brutality of objectification, of just being turned into a total object, which then ends up being unsatisfying, not to give spoilers, to the person who was objectifying that. It's such a brutal but kind of beautiful way to talk about that experience of how it's just kind of like a soul-sucking process to be turned into an object of someone else's, like you're saying, cum rag experience.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think probably still, especially in any Western culture, like I think we can single-handedly say that the majority of women have this experience much more than men, especially like heterosexual men. But I think, I'm friends with quite a few men who are or were sex workers. And I do think that when you shift the power dynamics or put any kind of person in that hypersexualized space, I don't think that the power structure really changes or the dynamics really change, even if this is women or gay men doing this to a man, right? It's just like, it's not as common. So I don't think we think about that. And so we have kind of the stereotypes of how those types of systems sort of objectify women. And that's kind of the common narrative. And yet, the singular experience when I speak to men who have been in this situation where they are highly sexualized or feel objectified or whatever, the kind of similar degrees of entitlement from people who purchase them or who view them being on display seems identical to all of my discussions with women who are in those same spaces. I just think there are far fewer men who are probably experiencing that just because we're not really socialized that way when we're very young. You know what I mean? I think this kind of like, you have to kind of put yourself in that position. And I guess I did, at age 19.
Because it's touted as like a dream job for men,
right?
Right. And which is why you have even less of an avenue to speak out in, anything but it was the greatest ever. I got to fuck for a living,
Yeah. I mean, and it's not like I'm saying this was all just a fucking nightmare. I mean, I did have fun.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And that's in the book too.
Yeah.
Like there are references to like, and like sometimes it was fucking fun. But like mostly the book feels pretty visceral. And I was very confronted by exactly what we're talking about right now, of just like my lack of expansiveness. Like, of course, like I understand that the patriarchy harms all of us, but mostly I am in a world that really decenters men. And so I'm so immersed in the experiences of women and how the male gaze, patriarchal power, these sorts of things are on the daily really harmful to us. And like reading your experiences and the experiences of your characters, which are obviously an extension of yourself and your community, I was like, whoa, like there's so much overlap here in our experiences of the world. And actually, like, I mean, you were in a world where the violence of it was a little bit more potent than a lot of the, experiences that I have in my daily life right now. I do have a question here, but I think that like something clicked for me as to why like working with you has been so amazing. Because generally speaking, like I've been like, I'm super proud that I now have a production crew that's all like queer folks and women, right? Like that's always been my goal, to create spaces that decenter cis men as much as possible. Like the one exception being like, if you ever want to come back to working on set, like Chris, you are all like, I want to be working with you in as many ways as is humanly possible. And so it's just like,
Really appreciate
I get it. Like you have, it's almost like the veil has been lifted for you.
Mm-hmm.
And like you have as strong of a critique of the harm of the patriarchy as like any, you know, queer, trans person, feminist I know.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Yay.
Yeah. I mean, thank you. I mean, first of all, thank you. I've loved working with you in all capacities. I don't know if I'm going to be back on set, but that's a totally different discussion. Regarding the rest, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think to some degree, it has allowed me to have these kind of really rich relationships with women, and but I'm in this weird place in my life right now that I think because of a lot of the people who are really close to me are either people from the sex industry, or, you know, like my entire community is almost women, male sex workers, or like queer people, meaning like I have, you know, two of my closest friends are trans. And yet I still, despite all of this stuff that I'm writing, I do find it kind of sad that I don't know. And I think this is like a cultural thing on a pretty large level, but for me, it's really important in my life to try and figure out like what like positive role models for masculinity are. And I'm still kind of in a process of trying to discover that. But, you know, when people talk about, in my sphere of influence, like decentering men, or like, you know, this sort of what, like hashtag fuck the patriarchy stuff, I totally get it, but I'm like, but what is, I don't know, the part of like leftist discourse, especially in the last 10 years, has really sort of denigrated the role of men in society for like very real reasons, right? But this is still half the population, and I actually have quite a bit of empathy for men and hope for men to try to like add positive contributions to this world. And I'm trying to do that as a person. And sometimes I don't really know what to do in those spaces, because it's like, you know, having gone through all of this shit that is discussed in this book in kind of a more extreme way than maybe was the reality of it. But I, coming out the other end, have a lot of like desires for more traditional lifestyles, meaning like I'm really attracted to things like monogamy and family and so forth, because I spent most of my life basically trying to do the opposite of that. And it, I think, ended up harming me in many ways. And yet, you know, when I talk to some people who are in my community, they will say things like, well, the nuclear family is like inherently patriarchal and colonialist. And I'm like, well, what is sort of the middle ground here?
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't like inherently believe that like wanting these sort of sense of security, or to be in a relationship with a cis woman and be in love and like, you know, try to have a family, that's like a negative thing or like inherently patriarchal. I mean, I can have incredible empathy for someone who is my partner, right, and want these sort of like positive aspirations in our life. I think the problem here right now is like we have 1,000, 2,000 years of human history in which we're now acknowledging all of these incredibly systematic institutionalized problems that I guess you can point having a lot to do with men in power, right? And these are on some subcultural levels starting to break down in certain communities in which I think we're starting to see some alternative ways to live. But I don't know. I think even like, you know, I've obviously had sex with many, many, many men, but like I'm still more or less like a hetero guy with a lot of those aspirations in life. And I don't know. I just don't know what to say about it now because it's like, I feel like for the first time in my life, I have a normie job. I'm not doing all of this stuff and I don't know how to move forward because it's like this part of my life is still such a heavy piece of baggage. And I often just don't know how to relate to people who don't come from that same background.
The thing is a lot of these beliefs, like the kind of just inherited cultural norms, like a lot of people aren't forced to challenge them. You know, I think that there's like, I'm starting to group it as like, oh, there's normies and then there's people who've had transgressive experiences that just ultimately like really alter your worldview. And it's interesting that you say that you have a lot of aspirations towards this kind of nuclear family and being drawn to what might be kind of like a normie tendency, because there is something like there's such a critique throughout the book of, you know, male gaze, abuse of power, patriarchy, and also there was is the short story or essay called The Artist?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
well,
and there's like something that I connected to personally, The Artist, in that piece of like paternal detachment. And that's also like such a common thread that I think runs through like toxic masculinity in our culture, is this like notion that fathers like don't have really any obligation to show up within like the family structure, and then there can just be this lineage of like this inherited kind of like absence of this like positive male role model. Certainly my experience in my family lineage, where there's just like a void where this positive male role model should be, like kind of like anywhere down the line, right? Like you just go further and further down the line and he's just not fucking there.
Well, and Chris was just speaking to that in the sense of trying to find that in the culture at large. Like, where is it? Where's our positive role model as a culture?
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess like, you know, is like these themes in your work, is this like you kind of trying to work through your personal pain around it? Is this like you trying to kind of be in a larger conversation with your readers about like, we need to be thinking about these things? Like why and how do these themes show up in your work?
Well, I don't think I'm inherently trying to have that conversation with my readers. I think this all starts at a really personal level, and I think this book was one of the first times that I was at a place where I could look back at a body of work and say, "Oh wait, I keep doing this over and over again. What does that mean?" And particularly in that story, The Artist, it's something I actually want to expand into a novel at some point. At least that thing. It is kind of this magical realist take on the reality of my family history. And I guess I'll just be honest here. So, you know, like you said in your family, and I think this is common for a lot of people of the past several generations, at least in the United States, it's like my father didn't really raise me. I think he had intentions, but like we only got close when I was an adult and I got to tell him to fuck off. And I think that was the first time that he sat there and listened to me and was like, okay. And then we became friends, and then I guess developed a sort of father-son relationship. But it was after he had any responsibility to me, you know? And for a lot of my childhood, I just hated him because, you know, he was abusive towards my mother, a little bit towards me, and then was mostly not around, started another family, had some desires here and there to be with me, but I don't think had the ability to pull that off. But once I was an adult and understood where he came from, it's like this never-ending cyclical thing. I mean, so he is a first-generation immigrant from Germany, and he was born in an American military camp at the end of World War II, and his father was an artist who had been conscripted into the Nazi party, basically, and because he wasn't really like a soldier, they put him somewhere, I don't even know. Parts of my family say he was in Siberia, parts of my family say he was in Northern Europe, but all that's to say he was far away, knocked up my grandmother, and then this is like, you know, the end of the 40s, so it's like there's no internet. How do you find someone? And you're in bombed out Europe, and you're growing up without a father, and you're growing up basically in the country that everyone hates, right? It's the last period of time where everyone's like, this is fundamentally like the evil part of the world. And so he has no framework for what a father is, for what a good man is. And I can see that pattern in his life. And, you know, thank God I have a wonderful mother who I think a lot of the positive qualities I see in myself and in other people I've inherited from her, because, like, you know, she is like so many women of her generation, had to figure it out, had to raise children by herself, had to be the provider, had to be all of that. I have so much respect for her, but and you know, I think that's probably goes into a lot of just how I was trying to live my life in my early 20s and really latched onto, you know, a lot of like feminist ideology and so forth, because I believe women are wonderful. But on the other end of the spectrum, it's like, well, fuck, I'm still missing this male role model. And I can understand why my dad came up short, but like, how do I figure out how to be a little bit better than that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like your lifelong search is like, how do I not be this? And my lifelong search is like, how do men just like not exist in my world?
Yeah, fair enough. That's not like, you know, I get why you feel that way, but I'm also a man, and that's actually important for me to figure this out. So I'm starting to, but you know, it's a work in progress.
It's a big question, though, is like within a non-patriarchal structure, how do men exist and contribute in a not harmful way or not oppressive way? You know, and I think there's a lot of trying to figure that out. And that there can be comfort in this idea of like the nuclear family and thinking about like these sunshiny picket fences and kids running around and stuff. And then you can get into that and realize that it has its own kind of horror, Stepford wife kind of objectification and PTSD that can come out of that. And that it's not even the option that... It's almost like you're like, do I choose black metal, which I've been listening to all this time, and now my eardrums are blown out, or do I listen to like Simon and Garfunkel? And there is something in between that, you know. There is this other space that I think is really up to us to create in a lot of ways, because it hasn't been handed down to us. It's like a broken system, an exploitative system. You know, there's a lot of avenues to go through, but it's like all of this wealth of really perspective, I think, that you've gained through your experience as an objectified human and a sexualized human is like the powerful thing that I think is lacking in a lot of men is that lack of perspective, which, I mean, you earn through your hard knocks and everything. but it is like the kind of objectification that can happen to women like within a marriage. You know, there's sexual exploitation in the nuclear family and stuff like that just kind of gets dismissed or unaddressed in a lot of relationships or heteronormative relationships and stuff. So I do think there's got to be like a whole other kind of way of going through it, you know, of...
Robin and I are trying to promote the concept of the village. Like, how can we have like take some of the good things from the nuclear family and then also like bring our communities into it where like we feel like really resourced
without making a cult of the 70s. You know, it's really hard because like I kind of want a commune, but also I don't want a commune. Yeah. You know, so who knows? Well, we got to figure it out, but I guess that's the work of being human right now.
Well, if you figure it out, please let me know.
You'll be the only man invited.
There'll be a few.
No.
I do work.
Yeah. We know you work hard.
I just do the shit now with my computer. I'm not super handy.
Yeah.
Whatever.
That's okay. We've got plenty of lesbians.
Yeah. We don't need handiness. We got handy covered.
We cannot have a conversation about creation without talking about Luka Fisher. I really want to make sure that we talk about Luka's appearance in this book. You describe in the preface that there is a cruelty to how you write her. I mean, she does get killed in the very spoiler. She's killed in the first chapter, or essay, short story, but not with the same. I feel like generally there is a reverence to Luka in the book, and there is a little bit of a muse like quality, but to me, I kind of read her as like the bridge between the fictional and the autobiographical. And I'm just like, I know you said a little bit in the beginning about kind of how how creation came to be, but I am just really curious for you what the significance of, like, Luka is such a strong character that weaves the whole thing together. And I'm curious, like, what is the significance of that to you? Or why? Or
well, just to give people a little bit of context of who Luka is. So, she and I met on a porn set, like in 2011, 2012, something like that. She was an extra in like a zombie parody. So she just shows up there. I had no idea who she was. And again, some further context. Luka is a trans woman, but at the time I met her, she was male presenting. And I just thought this was some guy who was on a porn set who, I don't know if she has like some neurodivergence or it's just a very like, I don't know, forward, but she was the only person from this group of extras who came up to all the performers because we're all sitting separately, being a little like holier than thou or something. And Luka just starts asking us all these questions, and she ends up talking to me quite a bit. And I was honestly a bit put off by her at first.
I mean, on any set, this is a boundary that is rarely ever crossed, or there's PAs that will stop this from happening between the actors and the extras.
Correct.
Very forward.
So, but she's like immediately breaching this boundary, and she's also dressed like Andy Warhol in like this weird art splattered suit or something. And I'm just like, who the fuck is this person? And I was in a metal band at that time, and I kind of had a discussion about that with her. And lo and behold, the next show I play, Luka's there. And Luka has brought someone for me to meet. And again, I'm like, who are you? And what are you doing here? So, but this keeps happening. Like, she just keeps showing up to events and always just bringing other artists or people who she thinks would be interesting for me to collaborate with, or for them to just be in this space. And I get to know her a little bit better, and it's like her whole life is this weird, like she's just curating experiences for artists. So like she was putting out these zines, she was literally volunteering her time as like an A&R rep for a record label just so she could go to shows and be like, you should sign that band and that band should do. And I was just like, okay, so but it was always very like when I introduced her to other people, I think they're always like confused, like what the fuck does this person actually do? Like what is her art practice? And when I first had an ability to write about her some 10 years ago, I think because she and I had gotten close as friends at that point, it was an opportunity for me to be like, to kind of explain her to the world. And then unfortunately, like the publication that had agreed to do this just kind of folded and no one really saw this essay. So I wanted to bring it back into this collection, sort of represent her in a way that I don't know. I think it's hard to, because like most people who are artists, like even you could say like I'm a writer, like Chris writes books or Chris edits video, but it's like Luka is a little bit more of an elusive character here. She does paint, she does do performance art, she's a producer of often underground queer film, etc. But it's like this all seems like one conglomeration of like and a lifestyle for her. Mm-hmm. I think that's really kind of beautiful. And the reason that she's incorporated so much in this book, apart from my close relationship with her, is that during the time I was writing a lot of these stories and doing some of the visual material that's written about in this book, she was helping with all of this, or she was at least being like, Chris, you should write this story for my zine, or like, you should write this essay for whatever magazine because I know the editor and I'm going to do like an art piece for that's going to accompany it. And she ended up producing this short film that we made over the course of several years. This was a short film we made for my last novel and so forth. It was just like, she was so involved in all of this stuff, but from the outside, if you didn't know that, or if I didn't explicitly say this, how would anyone know that? You know what I mean? But I'm so grateful for her to kind of facilitate this stuff. Even some of the stuff that I think was kind of really fucked up or volatile, like she kind of convinced me, I think, to do some performance art adjacent stuff that was actually kind of violent and physically harmful to me. But at that point in my life, it was like this cathartic thing. And I don't know, I just wanted to document all of that and then talk about this also, not just in the language of extreme violence that makes up so much of my work, but my very sincere love for this person. I don't know.
All of that really comes across in the essay. Not only your love, but a kind of just like admiration or adornment. It's very adoring. But also what I loved is that I know Luka peripherally. And I don't know that Luka knows my name, but I know Luka's name. You know, maybe she does. I don't know. I would be honored. But like, you know, I picked up Sherry Rose for an interview, and she's telling me how Luka's going to pick her up later and do this and that, and just all these supportive things. Or I would be at a video shoot for a friend's band, and Luka's there. I'm not sure what she's doing. Just like you say, I'm not sure what her role is, but she's instrumental, I know, in bringing all of these people together. And that's happened multiple times where Luka will show up and I'm just like, oh, here she is again, just kind of with this whirlwind of artists around her. And I think I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but in this way of that, like she's the most supportive person of the art scene in this way of that there's however she can bring people together to make more work and to see the work that she wants to see in the world. You know, she's actually like my sense, it rang so true to me just from my peripheral sense of who Luka is, that she is this kind of like instrument of art in the world.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I think it's actually quite sweet. So, yeah.
It's very sweet. Yes.
Well, Chris, where can people find you? Where can they find your books? What do you have coming up?
Well, you can find me on both, I think, Instagram and X. I have not migrated to Blue Sky. I don't know that I'm going to, I think. But it's just my name, not Christopher, but I think it's at Chris Zeischegg at both of them. And Zeischegg is Zeischegg. This book and a re-release of my last novel both came out this year. That novel is called The Magician, and they're both out on a small press called Apocalypse Party. You can buy these books on Amazon, or you can just go to any of my social media accounts. There's often links, or just you can figure it out. You have Google. But yeah, I post about this stuff pretty frequently. So if you're interested, I don't think it's going to be that difficult to figure it out. And if you're not interested, that's okay. It's just not inherently anything someone needs to read, but it's some people like it.
Chris, thank you for spending this time with us today. It was really good to talk to you.
Likewise. It's good to see both of you. And thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to Fiercely Independent Media. Fuck Yeah Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by Robin Jennings and Sarah Tom Chesson, also known as my mom. Theme music by Suno AI. Your support means a lot. You can give to the show and receive perks at patreon.com/fuckyeahpod. You can also rate and review the show or share it with a friend. You can reach us at fyapod@gmail.com. Bye for now.